Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Thank you, Art. Thank you, Jane. Thank you very much for the award, the Edward Teller Award yesterday. That was a huge surprise and a really big honor. Diane and I are actually on vacation this weekend. We came here just because so many of our heroes are on the program, and we attended 2 years ago at the event in Tennessee, and it was just outstanding. So we're hoping that we can find a way to get here every year. There we go. Tony Heller dedicated his talk to Bill Gray. Bill Gray was a wonderful guy, and we all miss him very much. I'm going to dedicate my talk to Bob Carter. Bob Carter was a really dear friend. He passed away in January. I'll be talking a little bit more about Bob. I know he spoke at these events over the years. He was right in the middle of finishing the final volume of Climate Change Reconsidered, a major work, a 1,000-page piece of research. He was excited about it. We were trading email, 3 days before he had his heart attack. So we all really miss Bob. Diane and I drove over here from Illinois, a beautiful ride if you like corn and soybeans. We saw a ton of that. About, I think, an hour and a half from Omaha, Diane spotted a sign on the side of the road that said, "The Freedom Rock, next exit." Okay. And we said, wow, what is that? We got to stop and check that out. Well, turns out this is a 12-foot tall rock. This is painted on that rock. Okay. It's a 60-ton rock. It's called the Freedom Rock. Ever since 1999, a guy named Ray Michael Sorensen II, his friends call him Bubba, has been painting this rock. Each year he repaints it. He covers what was done last year, and then he paints a new patriotic theme on this rock. He paints it during the month of May, and he's finished by Memorial Day. And it's just absolutely gorgeous. That's the second side of it. That's the third side of it. The guy's got tremendous talent. So if you're heading back east after this event and driving, it's right off Interstate 80. And I'm sure if you use your GPS, you'll find the Freedom Rock. He's going around the country painting rocks like this, trying to put them in every city in Iowa and then spreading out even nationwide. All right, I'm here to talk about this book, Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming. It's a remarkable book with some remarkable authors, and I'll talk about the contents of it in a second, but first I want to talk about the distribution of the first volume and then distribution of the second edition. Many of you know there was a COP21 meeting in Paris last year in December, and we had hoped to get the final volume of the Climate Change Reconsidered series out in time for that, but we couldn't. So we decided to just publish one chapter, chapter 2, which focused on the question of consensus and why scientists disagree. We figured if we could just publish that as its own little paperback book, hand it out at this event, we could at least keep some attention for Climate Change Reconsidered and keep the other side playing defense a little bit on what is their favorite talking point, this claim of scientific consensus. So we produced this little paperback book. A donor called almost immediately and said, "How many copies of this are you printing?" And I said, "Probably 2,000, 3,000. And he said, "I want you to print 54,000 copies. I want you to send it to every state legislator, every national elected official, all the journalists, all the professors in your database, all our allies and friends, all of Heartland's donors, heads of civic and business groups all across the country, and give it away to Tea Party group activists and other volunteers and people who are interested." Well, fantastic. So in December, we printed 54,000 copies of the book and went about distributing copies. We ran out of copies about 4 weeks ago. And in the course of the last 3 months, I got calls from other donors saying, "Well, finally, a short book from the Heartland Institute instead of something that's 1,000 pages long. And I love the cover design." I had one guy tell me that. Another guy said, "By focusing on the consensus question, you really are finally going right after the weak point and the most commonly used argument that the other side tries to throw at us." And so the topic is great, the authors are great, the design is great. And one of the donors said, well, what if you do a second edition? And who didn't you send the first edition to? And I said, well, I'd love to send it to every K-12 science teacher in the United States, okay? Because this is outlawed in Portland, Oregon, right? So if we could send this to every science teacher in high schools across the United States, that would be fantastic. The problem is it's a big list. It's 159,000 teachers. And he said, do it. He says, and try to raise money from other people, but if you come up short, I'll make up the difference. And I said, great. And he said, who else would you like to send it to? And I said, well, there's about 160,000 professors of physical science around the United States. I'd love to drop this in the inbox for every professor of physical science in the United States. He said, okay, sounds like a good list. Go ahead and do that. And I said, well, and it gets better. Isn't this amazing? These are big numbers. When Cato or Heritage or Hoover or Hudson publishes a book, they'll often do 3,000 or 4,000 copies. That's it. They might sell 1,000 or 2,000 copies, and then they remainder the rest. We've got a room full of books that the Cato Institute gave us that they couldn't sell. They were about to recycle them. So for distribution of a non-fiction book like this is a big deal. So the third and final list, I said, well, I think we should reach business leaders. Too many of them are just ignorant about the issue and taking the wrong side on the issue and afraid to speak out on the issue. So we can rent a list of 45,000 CEOs of the biggest companies in the United States. Let's send them the book. And the donor said, okay, yeah, let's try to do that as well. And then the donor said, by the way, I notice it's black and white. Why don't you do it in color and add some pretty graphs to it? Okay, that's going to increase the cost. I'll cover that. And how about if you add a DVD? Add a DVD to it. Now, a lot of books these days do come with DVDs. About 6 or 7 years ago, David Legates and Willie Soon appeared in a DVD. It was titled Unstoppable Solar Cycles. It was produced by Free to Choose Media, which produced the Milton Friedman Free to Choose series. It's only 10 minutes long, and it's really good stuff. And so I said, well, I suppose we could, but that's going to be kind of expensive. He said, well, figure it out, get an estimate. So we just bought 370,000 copies of that DVD. And it's going to be mailed out with these books. And we got a program where we're going to send out about, 45,000 books every 2 weeks or so, starting now all the way through this year. And every teacher, every college professor, and the CEOs of 45,000 businesses are going to be getting a copy of this book and a DVD that goes along with it. So the previous speaker, Steve, is he still in the room? Fundraising isn't easy. Fundraising isn't easy. It's not fun. It's the last thing on the to-do list. And since activists like us would love to edit, write, speak, network, do anything but beg for money, it often doesn't get done. But when you get a good product, and if you're willing to camp out on the phone, talk to these guys, send out letters, get a decent proposal, it can be successful. So this book is going to go out in huge numbers. When we mail 370,000 copies of this book, we're going to get 50,000 back, okay? Undeliverable, bad addresses or something. So then we got to distribute 50,000 more. If any of you would like copies of this book, a few hundred, a few thousand, if you know how to distribute 1,000 copies of this book, seriously, for free, talk to us. And I suspect that we can turn right around and send the returns to a list that you provide us, or 5 books shipped right to you, or to a high school, or to a college, or to a think tank that you belong to, or an advocacy group, or a chamber of commerce, or a Rotary Club, any of these groups. This is a great book. It's easy to read, and the price is right for you guys. Other donors are willing to do it. All right, real briefly, what is the Heartland Institute? It's a nonprofit organization devoted to discovering, developing, and promoting free market solutions to social and economic problems. So we're interested in freedom. We're convinced that ideas have consequences, that freedom is the most important and most consequential idea ever discovered by mankind, that it's responsible for all of the prosperity, all the freedom, all the liberty and all the virtue that we have, and it's under attack. It's absolutely under attack today, maybe unlike anything we've seen in the last 30, 40 years. So we come to its defense. We address a lot of issues, but we also address global warming. We first started to address global warming in 1993. It was a book titled Eco-Sanity, A Common Sense Guide to Environmentalism. Had a chapter in there on global warming. Starting in 2008, 2007, we started to ramp up our activities on global warming. And that was partly donor-driven. We had some donors approach us. Essentially, they were saying, we want to get involved in the environmental debate. Joe, what issue do you think is really important? And where is a niche? Where is an activity that other think tanks aren't doing? And I said, well, one thing that's missing is none of the free market think tanks are willing to talk about the science of global warming. Cato, Heritage, AEI, Hoover and Hudson, they don't debate the science. They say that they're economists and political scientists mostly, so they're going to judge the price of trying to do something, but they don't really want to argue the science on it. So I said, here's an opportunity for us to do something. So we designed an ad. Some of you may have seen it. It said, global warming is not a crisis. And then it had a picture of Al Gore, and it had a picture of a global warming skeptic. And I think it was Pat Michaels and Chris Horner, and I don't know if we might have used Art, we might have used Willie Soon. We cycled through a half a dozen skeptics. And then underneath that it said, Al Gore, why won't you debate your critics? ? We ran that ad 60 or 70 times in the Wall Street Journal over the course of 2 years. And I think it served the purpose of polarizing the debate. And that's usually not something you want to be proud of, but frankly, global warming alarmism is a Democratic Party liberal cause. I mean, it's just it's a fake issue that was created for the left to achieve its agenda. As simple as that. And so by pointing that out, making it clear, and sending it out over and over again, I think we helped define this as a partisan issue. We made sure that no Republican could embrace global warming alarmism without paying a pretty serious price for it. So in 2012, The Economist called us the world's most prominent think tank promoting skepticism about man-made climate change. The New York Times called us the primary American organization pushing climate change skepticism. More recently, Global Environmental Change, which is a peer-reviewed journal, published a big report on conservative think tanks and what they do on this issue. They called us a central actor among conservative think tanks, et cetera, et cetera. According to this study, the Heartland Institute has published just under 10 million words on global warming. 10 million words. Diane and I edited 90% of those words. That is 39% of all of the words published by conservative think tanks on global warming. 39% came just out of the Heartland Institute. And the second and third ranked organizations we either fund or they are reprinting most of our work. So I suspect we're even above 39%. And finally, that wasn't weighted by distribution. When we do a book, we'll send out 10,000 copies. That DVD that I told you about, we distributed over 500,000 of those over the course of 3 or 4 years when it was first released. So we do big volume distribution as well. This book has 3 authors. You're probably familiar with all of them. Craig Idso, Dr. Idso, the world's leading expert on the effect of carbon dioxide on plant and animal life, chairman of the Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change. The second author is Bob Carter, now deceased. Bob was the author of Climate Change, The Counter Consensus, which is just a terrific book. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it to you. He was a paleogeologist. And finally, Dr. Fred Singer, the world's most distinguished physicist and the founder of the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change. About NIPCC, this book is actually published by the Heartland Institute, but it's produced by NIPCC, the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change. Fred founded this in Milan, Italy in 2003 with Frederick Seitz and a few others. It's an international panel of non-government scientists and scholars. It receives no funding from the government, any government. It's a joint project now of 3 organizations: Fred's Science and Environmental Policy Project, the Heartland Institute, and Craig Idso's Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change. These are some of the publications that were produced by NIPCC so far. I think there's 8 of them listed on here. I think there's 1 or 2 that are missing from this list. This book in particular focuses on the question of consensus, and our conclusion is the most important fact about climate science, often overlooked, is that scientists disagree about the environmental impacts of the combustion of fossil fuels on the global climate. To every person in this room, this is obvious, and it's common sense, and it's not fighting words. To most of the people outside of this room, this is a revelation. I mean, the President of the United States tells us that there's a 97% consensus. The Secretary of State tells us that. The heads of all the major universities, National Academy of Sciences, they all claim that there's this, entire agreement on the costs or consequences of using fossil fuels. In fact, there is not. So one of the voices out there claiming consensus is NASA. You go to NASA's website, and you'll see this. There's a page devoted to consensus. It says multiple studies published in peer-reviewed scientific journals show that 97% or more of actively publishing climate scientists agree. Climate warming trends over the past century are very likely due to human activities. Now you can excuse the Google or the waffling and some of that language. Check out footnote 1, that footnote to the journals. This is what it says. It cites 4 sources. Okay? John Cook, Anderegg, Doran and Zimmerman, and Oreskes. Take a quick look at these in reverse order so that they're in chronological order. The first one is Naomi Oreskes in 2004, published in Science, the Science Journal. She's a socialist historian. Okay, she was a professor at the University of California, San Diego. According to David Horowitz, that's the most left-wing college in the United States. And that is saying something, right? I think socialists are lonely on that campus because the communists pretty much run everything. She claims to have examined 928 abstracts from papers published from 1993 to 2003. She said that 75% of the abstracts either implicitly or explicitly supported the IPCC's view that humans are responsible for most of the observed warming over the previous 50 years. Here's the problems with this source citation. First, it's not peer-reviewed. NASA said it appeared in a peer-reviewed publication. It did. But it's an op-ed piece in Science. It was an essay. It was an opinion piece. It was never peer-reviewed. Okay? She searched for global climate change instead of climate change. By doing that, she left out 92% of all the articles that talk about climate change, including apparently many of them that talk about natural causes of climate change. She's not a scientist. As a result, she misinterpreted many of those articles. She looked at the abstract and thought that she could conclude exactly what those scientists were saying and what they meant and how close they came to the IPCC's finding. Well, not being a scientist, she made a lot of mistakes. Okay. The abstracts themselves mischaracterize the findings of many of the articles. Turns out there's a whole literature on this. How accurately do abstracts of academic articles summarize the content of the article? Very poorly. Why? Because the authors of the paper write the abstracts and they cram them full of keywords in hopes that other academics who are doing Google searches come across them and then cite them in their own papers. That's how you get tenure. That's how you get rank in the academy, is when other people cite your articles. So abstracts are jammed full of keywords that have nothing to do with what the study itself is about. And studies of abstracts find that they systematically exaggerate the findings. Even if there wasn't a statistically significant finding in this article, the abstract claims that there was. This is basically an advertisement for the paper, not a summary of the paper. She never explained how many of the articles addressed whether human activity was responsible for climate change. A lot of these articles are about the mating behavior of frogs in Brazil. Nothing to do with global warming, okay? The authors are not taking a position on whether or not global warming is man-made or if it's a bad thing, okay? All they're doing is writing an article about frogs making love in Brazil. And they're speculating, well, people say there's global warming going on, and if it gets warmer, maybe there's going to be more lovemaking by frogs in Brazil. And that gets counted as supporting the consensus. She never explained how many articles agree with the IPCC's definition of climate change. It's a pretty specific definition. She was generalizing. Her findings have never been replicated. And in fact, a study aimed at updating her findings that used her same methodology found only 7% of recent papers support the alleged consensus. Okay, so nobody should ever cite Oresky's 2004 as evidence of a consensus. How about the second study? Maggie Kendall Zimmerman and Peter Doran. Okay, Maggie was a college student. This was a thesis paper that she wrote. Peter Doran was her thesis advisor, putting his name on it, got it published in a peer-reviewed journal in 2009. Okay, what did this study consist of? A 2-minute online survey of earth scientists working for government agencies and universities. You know what's wrong with that? I mean, there is so much wrong with that. A 2-sentence question that was sent out to a list of earth scientists that she pulled off of the internet. Earth scientists who are working only for government agencies and universities, nobody outside of those two universes. She asked the wrong people. According to her own methodology, she excluded solar scientists, space scientists, cosmologists, physicists, meteorologists, and astronomers. Well, you think those guys might have an opinion on the subject, right? And that it would be informed. Most of these guys and gals, space scientists, also would appreciate the role of the sun in climate, right? These are folks who are looking at solar patterns and such. Well, they're systematically excluded from this survey. Only 5% of the respondents even said that they were climate scientists. Okay. More about this same study. She asked the wrong question. This is very typical of these surveys. She asked, have temperatures risen, and was human activity a significant contributing factor? Depending on the range that you're talking about, most people would agree that there had been a modest increase in temperature. Fred Singer doesn't believe that, and I respect Fred. But even most skeptics would agree that there was a mild warming trend at the end of the 20th century, and that there is a human impact on climate. You release trillions of tons of gases, you clear forests, you irrigate millions of acres of farmland, you're going to have an impact on climate. And it might even be statistically significant. You might be able to measure it. So as a skeptic myself, I would probably answer yes to both of these questions. So she's asking the wrong question if she's looking for evidence of agreement with the IPCC. The 98% consensus figure refers only to the views of 79 climate scientists. So she pulled out that group that self-identified as climate scientists and took a look at them, and wow, almost every one of them self-identifies as a climate alarmist. But it's only 79. Obviously, it's not the consensus of the scientific community. The third study is another college student, William R. Love Anderegg et al., 2010. Another college student doing a paper for his professor. His professor adds his name to it and gets it published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. What did Billy find? Billy claims to have found that 97% of climate researchers most actively publishing in the field support the United Nations IPCC findings. Okay. He looked at the 50 most prolific alarmists. They were published an average of 408 times each. 98% of those 50 agreed with the IPCC. There's your 98% consensus of 50 scientists. Well, okay, so he used Google Scholar to identify the universe of all these scholars. That is not a high-quality source. Joe Bast appears when you use Google Scholar. My op-ed pieces appear. This is not peer-reviewed literature. Like Oresky's 2004 study, it's an abstract counting exercise. So all he's doing is counting abstracts of articles that were written by these scientists. And once again, that's not a reliable way to know what was actually in those articles. And being published less often does not mean a scientist or her views are less credible. It used to be, 10, 15 years ago, that getting published once or twice a year in a peer-reviewed journal was considered a really good job. That was enough to keep tenure in most colleges and universities. To do the actual research involved, to do a quality article that could get published in a peer-reviewed journal, that's a full-time job. And a lot of academics with teaching loads can't do it. Once you leave the academy, you publish less. Doesn't mean you're less qualified to comment on the issue, right? So number of publications is not a proxy for whether or not you're credible. In fact, it could be just the opposite. Being published 408 times isn't evidence of quality, it's evidence of fraud and a broken peer-reviewed process. In the global warming literature today, we're seeing more and more articles with 20, 30, 40 authors. So every time one of those articles get published, 20, 30, 40 alarmists get to add one to their resume. Well, no wonder it goes up. You know, they can get 10, 15, 20 peer-reviewed articles in a single year because they're just adding their name to a list of other authors who have done the work. You got to ask, if you've had 408 peer-reviewed articles, how many of those did you read, Professor, before you put your name on it? How many of them did you actually look at the database? How many did you challenge the methodology that your co-authors were using? And obviously, 98% of 50 scientists is not consensus. The fourth and final source cited by NASA is what I call the wacky Australian blogger, John Cook, 2013, published in Environmental Research Letters. He claimed to find 97% of articles published from 1991 to 2011 endorse the view that human activity is responsible for some warming. And that's my phrasing, because as it turns out, he wasn't able to determine anything more specific than that. First of all, it's biased. Mr. Cook is not an objective observer of the literature. Okay, he runs an alarmist blog. He's the author of a book titled Climate Change Denial, Heads in the Sand. He's over the top in his criticism of global warming skeptics. It's another abstract counting exercise, so it's just like Naomi Oresky's 2004 article. We have no way of knowing if the underlying articles were accurately reflected by the abstracts or that he categorized those abstracts correctly. David Legates and Chris Monckton, and I think Willie Soon was in on this article as well, took a look at the data, concluded that only 0.3% actually endorse the standard definition of consensus, that most of the warming since 1950 is anthropogenic. Okay, so when other scholars looked at that data, they found just the opposite. Richard Toll, a very prominent economist in the debate, said the main finding of the paper is incorrect, invalid, and unrepresentative. And Chris Monckton said the project was not a scientific investigation, but a public relations exercise. Okay, so while there is no good evidence of consensus, there is no survey. There isn't even an abstract counting exercise that shows anything like consensus on this issue. There is plenty of evidence of disagreement among scientists. Klaus Martin Schulte in 2008 used Naomi Oresky's methodology and found that the proportion of papers that now explicitly or implicitly endorse the consensus has fallen from 75% to 45%. Fewer than half of the articles published more recently seem to endorse the so-called consensus. Dennis Bray and Hans von Storch, very interesting guys in Germany. They've done a series of surveys of climate scientists internationally. This is the 2012-2013 survey. On 54 of the questions that they asked, about a third of the scientists end up skewing toward the alarmist side. About a third are skeptics, and a third say they just don't know. So he presents bell curves for each question, and if it skews to the to the left. I'm trying to do this backwards for you guys. If it skews to the left, then it's alarmist. If the bell curve is right in the middle, that means most of the scientists just don't know. And if it skews to the right, then most scientists are skeptics. And you look through all of his questions, and you'll see these bell curves over and over again. A third of them skew left, a third of them skew right, and a third of them are right down the middle. Scientists don't agree on the underlying science of the whole issue. Verhagen et al., fewer than half of meteorologists that they surveyed agree with the IPCC's claim. The American Meteorological Society did a survey in 2012, found only 52% of its members believe that the warming of the last 150 years was man-made. Only 40% believe it could be dangerous. Kenneth Richard presented 250 peer-reviewed papers published in 2015 alone, finding natural factors are a dominant climate driver. Okay, if you're looking for evidence of consensus, maybe you should look for whether there's a consensus on natural factors. See how many studies support that, instead of trying just to focus on man-made impacts. And finally, I like this because Phil Jones, way back in 1993, when I first started to read about the global warming debate, I believe it was Pat Michaels, who told me that the global temperature data is all in the hands of a guy named Phil Jones at the University of Anglia in the UK, and he doesn't share it with anybody. And I said, I don't believe that. That can't possibly be right. And he says, yeah, that's right. He refuses to give up that data. And then when they keep coming after him, it turns out he lost it all. Doesn't have the original data. He only has the homogenized data, the adjusted data. Just craziness. So Phil Jones, during the ClimateGate scandal, was asked by the BBC if the scientific debate is over, and he said, I do not believe the vast majority of climate scientists think this. This is not my view. So even Phil Jones doesn't believe that the scientific debate is over. And finally, the best evidence was produced by the gentleman sitting right here, Art Robinson's Oregon petition, signed by 31,478 American scientists, including, I hope, most of the people in this room, including 9,021 with PhDs, all signing a petition that says there is no convincing scientific evidence that human release of carbon dioxide, methane, or other greenhouse gases is causing or will, in the foreseeable future, cause catastrophic heating of the Earth's atmosphere and disruption of the Earth's climate. And Art and his family and friends, at great personal expense, went through and reconfirmed all those names in 2007. This is a current list. It's way bigger than any list that the other side has. It's much more reliable. These are real scientists taking real positions. They're not just cherry-picked by a few disciplines. This isn't based on abstracts of their academic work. This isn't just guys who work for the government or work for a university. These are real scientists in the United States making an unequivocal statement that there is no consensus on global warming. So why do scientists disagree? I think it comes down, everybody in this room has their own ideas on this, and you're all right, because there is no one reason why scientists disagree about global warming. I think it comes down to four, and in our book, we summarize four reasons. The first is climate is an interdisciplinary subject that requires insights from many fields of study. Very few scholars have mastery of more than one or two of these disciplines. Willie soon mentioned Ian Plimer. And Ian lists all these academic specialties that are involved. If you want to be an expert or call yourself an expert on global warming, you better know something about archaeology, geology, physics, statistics, the science of forecasting, all these disciplines that virtually nobody writing in this field knows much about. So it's an interdisciplinary subject where all these different guys come to different conclusions and have different insights, and very difficult to get them all to come into the room and agree on a single point of view. A second reason for disagreement is fundamental uncertainties arise from insufficient observational evidence, disagreements over how to interpret the data, and how to set the parameters of models. Richard Lindzen talks about this. Judith Curry talks about it. There's a literature on what they call wicked problems, wickedly difficult problems. If you Google wicked problem, you're going to find that now there's academic articles about these problems. And global warming is one of those problems. The data just don't support easy answers or single answers. There's multiple answers depending on what direction you go into the issue from. There is no answer. Judith Curry says 10 years, 20 years, 50 years from now, we're going to be pondering and debating what the human impact is. Okay. Number 3, the IPCC, created to find a human impact on global climate, is not a credible source. It is agenda-driven and a political rather than scientific body, and some allege it is corrupt. Some is my code name for when I'm undercover. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it was created to create the appearance of consensus. It was created in recognition that this issue is very complex and that scientists, everyday working scientists, would need to find a single source that they could turn to with confidence. And so they created this entity and then quickly took it over and turned it into an advocacy organization for having the United Nations do something about this problem. Okay? Right from the beginning, the purpose was to identify human impact. And they jumped right from that to what should we do about this human impact. And with each successive report, it's become more and more politicized, more direction-driven, less objective, less open to criticism, less open to competing points of view. There are plenty of scientists who have resigned from the IPCC to protest the gross misuse of what they're doing. And last thing I'll say about the IPCC that's just blows my mind, they publish the summary for policymakers before the rest of the book is finished editing. So you publish the summary before you publish the full book, right? And the summary is edited and gone over word by word, sentence by sentence by environmental activists, government agency officials, and some scientists. And they do this in sessions that run until 3 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the morning. And they'll run it for 3, 4, 5 days until objectors are exhausted and falling asleep. And then when they get the right combination of people in the room, with the strongest bladders, I suppose, those are the guys who get to decide what's in the summary for policymakers. And then they go back and edit the full study so that it's consistent with the summary for policymakers. And this is public record. This isn't even a mystery. The New York Times reports these sessions in its news coverage of the IPCC reports. That's not how science is done. It's not how science is done. And that's why the name of this organization is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Okay, it's not international. It's not interscience. It's intergovernmental. This is a government agency, a government bureaucracy of the United Nations, arguably the most corrupt international institution the world has ever seen, and it's telling us what we're supposed to believe about a wickedly difficult problem called climate change. Oops. All right, and the fourth and final reason, if I can get this to back up, is climate scientists, like all humans, can be biased. Origins of bias include careerism, grant-seeking, political views, and confirmation bias. The ClimateGate emails, released in 2 sets over the years, show climate scientists acting all too human, threatening editors, getting articles squashed, hiding the decline, all of this misbehavior. It's not because they're evil guys, it's because they're academics trying to advance their own careers, trying to stifle criticism, and it happens every day in every department. The problem here is billions of dollars are at stake and millions of lives are at stake. So what would ordinarily be petty academic disagreements have real-world public policy consequences. This issue, grant-seeking, careerism, there's a literature on herding, like you herd cattle. If you do academic herding, just Google that. Fascinating, fascinating. How academics, all like lemmings, or like a school of fish, they all kind of coordinate and align their points of view with what their colleagues are doing. And they do that so that they can get co-authors, so that they can make it through peer review, so that they can get grants, so that they can get tenure, so that they can brush up their resume, so that they can get appointed to committees and boards and build out their academic careers. And after you do that for a few years, it becomes natural and invisible to you. It's like what they say about fish. Fish don't know they're in water, right? And it's all around you. And so academics swim in this polluted, I think, sewer of careerism and grant seeking and politicization. And the result is there's a lot of bad science being published on climate change. All right, so in light of all of this, why don't liberals get this? Why is it only conservatives who seem to be willing to challenge this? This is a great book, David Friedman, titled Wrong: Why Experts Keep Failing Us and How to Know When Not to Trust Them, published in 2010. I highly recommend it to you. And he writes, many liberals seem constitutionally incapable of giving fair consideration to, or in some cases even acknowledging, expert evidence and arguments, even if in the minority, that question whether we are really in the midst of a man-made global climate crisis. That's absolutely right. They refuse to ask the questions. They refuse, as I like to put it, to look under the hood. Okay, what are we being sold here? Is there really something there? And they have no reason to look under the hood because it supports all of their biases. It supports their political agenda. It's just another talking point for them. And so when you argue with a liberal about global warming, they say, well, it's going to hurt agriculture. And you say, well, no, actually, agricultural yields have been going up year after year. If it hurts agriculture, you'd think that we would see some sign of that. And carbon dioxide is actually plant food, so it's good for agriculture. And they say, yeah, well, but it causes water shortages. And you say, well, no, actually, melting, that's a great point that Bjorn Lomborg makes. Melting glaciers actually provide more drinking water for nearby cities and will for a century before those glaciers are gone. So what's the problem with melting glaciers? It actually increases drinking water and water available for agriculture. And they'll say, yeah, well, renewable energy creates jobs. And you say, well, no, actually it destroys 3 jobs for every job that it creates. You can't win with these guys. They just keep making up an argument, and it's because at the end of the day, the science doesn't matter to them, the economics doesn't matter to them. It's a talking point. It's a talking point by the Obama administration. Okay, it's part of his effort to transform the energy sector away from fossil fuels toward windmills and solar and conservation. It's part of a campaign to reduce American competitiveness. And it just fits with a political agenda. It's being used. It's a smokescreen for what is, in fact, an agenda. And the absence of consensus, the presence of a real lively debate among scientists, I think exposes that. They come into the debate claiming we're not going to argue the science because it's all settled. If we can push back on them and say, oh, no, it's not. Absolutely isn't. We have tons of evidence that says there's a robust debate and that this is not scientifically certain. That forces them to admit that, in fact, they have no clothes, that they can't make the scientific case. I think that's our point of entry to beating these guys. I don't know if I've got another slide or not. For more information, don't trust Google or Wikipedia. One of the real shocks over the last few years is the way that the left has taken over. Google, Wikipedia, Twitter, and Facebook even. You've probably followed some of the controversies there. Facebook is actually censoring conservative news sources for its news feature. Twitter is shutting down Twitter accounts when it decides that it's too libertarian or too conservative. Wow. Our Wikipedia site, I like to say it's been hacked. It is just full of lies and libel. Just incredible. We write and try to change them, and they just automatically undo all of our changes. And we try to recruit allies and friends and volunteers to make changes, and they just automatically undo all of those changes. And hundreds of thousands of people go to that site to learn what is the Heartland Institute. And all they get are lies about our funding and our past. So Wikipedia has gone way left. And finally, Google, The Heartland Institute has produced almost 10 million words on global warming. So how come when you Google global warming, we don't appear until page 3 or 4 on these results? How come Bill's Steak Shack that mentions global warming on the menu seems to show up before our websites do? I mean, that's deliberate. That's somebody putting a thumb on a scale. That's somebody deliberately suppressing Google search results for global warming skeptics. And we know what's happening. And that's really insidious. Yeah, really insidious. That's one reason why so many young people just seem so immune to argumentation and facts on this issue, because they rely so heavily on the internet. They rely on Google and Wikipedia, and those two sources are lying to them, hiding the real science and the real research. Okay, that's all I've got. Thank you very much.